This is the Pulsar PCMK2 TKL, Pulsar's latest keyboard release and one that massively improves over their previous keyboard releases. Now Pulsar isn't too well known for their keyboards, and for a good reason, as their previous releases were average at best. Pulsar of course was well aware of this, and they've been hard at work in the background on improving their keyboard lineup, and we're finally seeing the fruits of their labor, so to speak, as the PCMK2 is a very solidly performing board and a massive improvement over their previous keyboard releases. But while the PCMK2 is a step in the right direction for Pulsar compared to their old boards, compared to other high performance boards on the market, the board does have a lot of shortfalls, specifically with its stock switches. But we're going to talk all about the PCMK2's pros and cons in today's episode of the mel0n review. But before we get into it, I want to say a big thank you to Pulsar for sending over the PCMK2 for review. As always, this video will be fully timestamped, so if you're interested in a particular topic about the board, be sure to check the chapters down below. And if you enjoy the review, be sure to leave a like on this video and get subscribed. I'll be focusing more on keyboards this year, so if you want to see a particular keyboard cover here on the channel, let me know down in the comments. But without further ado, let's get right into today's episode of the mel0n review. In terms of pricing and versions, the board retails for $159.95 USD, and it's available in both ANSI and ISO layouts. As of this review, there is just a black-white colorway available for the board, but there will be a black-white colorway which will be released or has already released by the time this review goes live. You can purchase a separate customizable nameplate for the board that goes above the arrow keys for $5 USD that has a 6-character limit, so you can put your player tag or pretty much whatever you want on it as long as it's within a 6-character limit. Now in terms of in-game performance, initially I was really impressed with the PCMK2 The board felt great and performed really well from my testing. I really like 80% layout boards too, so the sizing and the layout of the board was perfect for me, and the board's customizable actuation points and performance features were very well implemented, and the board's stock acoustics were also pretty good. The board felt great for both general and gaming use, but this was temporary, as after a couple weeks of use, I started to have some major issues with the board's stock switches. Initially, the stock switches felt very smooth and snappy, but as I used them more and more, specifically the WSAD and number keys, the more used keys started to feel weirdly scratchy and high friction, to such a degree that they felt sandpapery when I tried to actuate them. So after a couple weeks of use, some of the keys on the board had higher actuation weights than the less used keys, and the most used keys felt scratchy as which made the board feel really bad. Initially I thought maybe the lubing on my switches was just bad, or maybe I got defective ones, but it turns out the issues I had with them wasn't a random defect, it was because of the design of the stock switches themselves, specifically their bottom housing. Now I'll talk more in depth about the design issues with the stock switches later in this video, but just to summarize, overall my experience with them was quite disappointing. Now as I mentioned earlier, I like the layout and the feel of the board, and since the board is hot swappable with some magnetic switch types, I decided to swap out the stock switches and use the Gateron Jade Pro switches instead, and those switches performed astronomically better than the stock ones, and they saved the board for me in all honesty, as I liked everything about the board. The biggest downside was just the stock switches, so replacing them made the overall experience here on the PCMK2 much better, and with proper switches the board performed amazingly, and I didn't have any other issues with the board once I swapped out these stock switches. In terms of unboxing, the board comes in a pretty standard packaging with the typical Pulsar colored branding across it. On the inside of the packaging lid here, there is a user manual and a quick start guide which gives you a quick breakdown of the board, its features, and some of the keybinds. There is also a Pulsar sticker included, which is a nice touch. Also included with the board is a USB A to C cable, similar to the ones we saw included with the Pulsar mice, just without that tilted USB-C end. There is also a metal keycap switch puller. Sadly, it's not a mechanical one like the one we saw included with the Keycaps HM80, but it's still usable for removing the keycaps or the switches. And lastly, we have the board itself, which is wrapped in a fabric wrapper which you can use as a little baggie to transport the board, and the board also has a hard plastic dust cover included, which is a nice attention to detail. Overall, a solid unboxing experience as expected for a Pulsar product. That said though, I do wish we saw a mechanical keycap or switch puller included, as those are much easier to use than the one included, and I would have also liked to see some extra switches included, but these are fairly minimal nitpicks. In terms of build quality and QC, overall the PCMK2 feels solid out of the box. The board itself is very very well built and there isn't any creaking or noticeable flexing to the board. The keycaps also feel great. They are a little hollow feeling, but still good nonetheless. All the keys on the board feel pretty good too. Admittedly, they're not as well stabilized as the keys on other high-performance boards are, such as the HM80, but they were still usable by all means. Overall, the board felt great and there was no major QC issues with the board itself. Again, the only issue area I had with this board was the stock switches, which I'll talk more about later in this video. In terms of board features, as I mentioned earlier, the board is an 80% layout with 87 keys. It uses custom Gateron X Pulsar magnetic switches. The board is a triple absorption structure with a transparent base and a CNC'd aluminum top housing. The board also supports full spectrum per key RGB lighting and customizable lighting under the nameplate as well. The board has 3 onboard memory profiles, so you can set individual lighting, actuation, and performance settings per profile. The board scans at up to 6000 Hz and pulls at 8000 Hz, and the board's polling rate is adjustable to 8000, 4000, 2000, and 1000. The board also supports Quick Tap, Pulsar's versions of SOCD, and Rapid Trigger, but there aren't any additional performance settings here aside from the ones I just mentioned, which I thought was kind of odd compared to other high-performance boards we've seen on the market that have a variety of performance features. The board also supports an adjustable actuation range of 0.1mm to 4mm, but this range might be lower depending on what switch type you use. The stock Pulsar X Gateron switches can utilize this whole supported range, but the Jade Pro switches I ended up installing only supported a 0.1 to 3.5mm range. Obviously, since I used other switches with the board, it does support hot swap ability with some magnetic switch types, but currently the board only supports Gateron Jade, Jade Pro, Jade Gaming, and TDC COM switches. The board also has a web-based software which is very well implemented, but I'll talk a little bit more about that later in this video. Alright, let's talk about what is the worst part of the PCMK2HE next, the stock switches. As I mentioned earlier, the board is using custom Gateron X Pulsar magnetic switches which have the following specs. The switch type is linear, they have an initial force of 30 ± 7 gram force, their total travel range is 4.1 ± 0.2 millimeters, their initial magnetic flux is 75 ± 15 grams, the bottom up magnetic flux is 700 ± 80 grams, the switch's top housing is a semi-transparent clear plastic, and the bottom housing is a white open base style. The stem type is a cherry stem, and they use a 2-pin mounting mechanism that we commonly see on magnetic switches. The switches are also factory lubed, and these switches are rated for 15 million plus keystrokes. Now, as it turns out, these switches aren't entirely unique, as these are just a modified version of Gateron's KS20 orange switches, as they have identical switch specs and housings. The only difference to them is the stem is blue on the Pulsar ones and orange on the Gateron versions. Now, the board stock switches look normal at first, but they have one very odd design feature, as they have an open base, not a solid base that we saw in the Gateron Jade series switches. And as it turns out, this is why I had so many issues with these stock switches, as the open base allowed the switches lubing to leak out of the switch over time, which is what caused the switches to get so scratchy and high friction over use. The worst offender out of the entire board was my number 2 key, as actuating the key specifically on an angle was so high friction the switch actually made an audible scraping sound, and the switch had so much friction it was actually difficult to properly actuate the switch. Now, to be fair, I've had lubing issues with Gateron switches before, specifically the Jade magnetic gaming switches I covered a couple weeks ago, but I had way more issues with the PCMK2HE switches than I ever had with the Jade gaming ones, and while you can technically open the switches to re-lube them, this is only going to temporarily fix them, as the lubing will eventually leak out the bottom of the switch's open base housing, causing the switches to become scratchy and weirdly high friction again. In all honesty, if these stock switches had a solid base housing, I'd have no issues with them, but this open base design makes the longevity of these stock switches very questionable, and because of this, if you get the PCMK2HE, I would highly recommend investing in some proper aftermarket switches, such as the Gateron Jade Pro switches, as they not only feel much better than the board stock switches, they also have significantly better durability. Hopefully we'll see Pulsar update the board to add on more compatibility with other magnetic switch types aside from the Gateron Jade and TTC COM switches. I'd love to see support added for Lecker switches and the other types of the the Gateron magnetic switches onto the board in the future, but we'll have to wait and see what Pulsar does. Next, let's talk about the board's keycaps. The PCMK2HE uses double-shot PBT keycaps. The walling of the keys is thinner than the thicker PBT keycaps we saw in the HM80, which does make them sound a little hollower than expected, but the keycaps still do feel quite good regardless. The caps have a great granular surfacing to them, similar to the granularity of the HM80 or TH80 SE's keycaps, which makes the keys very grippable and it's very easy to anchor your fingers on them during use. But since the keycaps are solid and non-shine through, they do mute the board's per key lighting significantly, so if you want to highlight the board's lighting a little more, I'd recommend using pudding or shine through keycaps as they'll complement the board's lighting much better, and since the stock switches use MX style stems, you can use pretty much whatever keycaps you want here. Just keep in mind that the stock switches are 30 gram force actuation, so I'd avoid using heavier keycaps to prevent any actuation issues on the board. In terms of ergonomics, the PCMK2HE is a much lower profile board than most high performance boards I've covered lately. The board's tilt is average, but the board's profile is much lower than say the TH80 SE or HM80's profiles. If you want to adjust the tilt of the board, you can do so via the board's feet, and it can be increased by 2 levels, so you can increase the angling of the board to make it more comfortable. And the board's keycap profile is cherry-like, just a flattened keycap design, and as I talked about earlier, the keycaps are very comfortable to type on, and in combination with the board's lower profile, the board is very comfortable to use for both work and general use cases. But one thing I wanted to note, since the board doesn't have any housing running along the sides of the board, on lower actuation points it's very easy to accidentally actuate the bottom row of keys, specifically the Control, Windows, and Alt keys. Much easier to do so than on other high performance boards I've tested lately, as your hands kind of rest against the bottom row of keys a bit due to the lower profile. Because of this, I'd recommend tilting the board a little more aggressively or using a wrist rest to avoid this issue. You can also increase the actuation point of the bottom row keys to a higher value so they can't be misactuated as easily, but to be clear, this issue isn't unique to the PCMK2HE. I've had this issue with every single high performance board I've tested lately, both with and without an outer housing, but just keep this in mind in case you have any kind of weird actuation issues with the bottom row keys on your board. In terms of acoustics, I'll give you a quick sound test here of the board with the stock Gateron X Pulsar switches here for you. Due to the board's triple absorption structure, the board's stock acoustics are pretty good. It's not as good as other high performance board I've tested, as it's a little more clacky than the smooth, creamy, thunky sound of other boards, but it's still not bad by any means. Now of course you can improve the PCMK2HE's acoustics by using aftermarket switches such as the Jade Pros, and here's how the board sounds with those switches. In terms of lighting, the board does have full range per key lighting as I mentioned earlier, but the light nodes on the board are south positioned instead of north like we commonly see, so you will have to install your switches upside down to accommodate this south pole position lighting. There is also a small light strip under the nameplate which is also full range and fully customizable. Now as I mentioned earlier, due to the non-shine through keycaps, the board's lighting is very muted. The switch's semi-transparent top housing also significantly cuts down on the amount of light that shines through the switches, so while the board does support a bunch of RGB profiles and is fully customizable, the only areas where the RGB is really going to be noticeable is in between the keycaps and under the nameplate. Now I personally don't mind the more muted RGB at all, but keep in mind that the board's RGB is much more muted in real life than it appears on the product page for the PCMK2HE on Pulsar's site. If you want the board's RGB to be a little more pronounced, I'd recommend using shine through keycaps or pudding keycaps, as they'll much better complement the board's RGB. And in terms of software, the PCMK2HE uniquely doesn't have any kind of local software, unlike most of the Pulsar products we've seen before. Instead, it actually has a web-based software, but to Pulsar's credit for this being their first version of a web-based software, it's actually quite good. Now to connect your board to the web-based software, simply plug it into your computer, open Chrome, Edge, or any other Chromium-based browser, navigate to the software URL, which I will have down in the video description, and then follow the on-screen instructions, select the board from the drop-down menu, and the board will be successfully connected. As I mentioned earlier, the board does support 3 onboard memory memory profiles, and you can assign individual lighting profiles, actuation points, performance settings to each layout. You can swap between the board's profiles either via the software or by pressing function plus 1, 2, or 3, but oddly enough, the board does take a moment to swap profiles. When you switch a profile, the board's lighting will turn a dim red for a second or two, and then the board will swap its profiles, so it's not going to be instantaneous like other high-performance boards, so keep that in mind. Now, the software itself is separated into 6 tabs. In each tab, you can swap between 3 onboard profiles by clicking the desired profile on the top bar to set individual settings to each profile. The first tab in the software is the lighting tab. Here you configure the board's per key lighting, nameplate lighting, and all the other lighting related features. Next, we have the key map tab where you can rebind or reassign keys on the board, adjust shortcuts, and other various key related features. But one really cool feature I haven't seen before here is that you can actually swap the key layout between Dvorak, Coleman, or Workman layouts natively in the software, which is a really cool thing to see. There is also a performance tab where you can tweak the board's performance settings such as enabling or disabling rapid trigger, adjusting the board's actuation points. You can also configure the switch type here with this little drop down menu, so if you swap the stock switches for any kind of the Gateron or TTC switches, you can select them here. Now oddly enough, there's no setting in the software to enable or disable quick tap, or better known as SOCD, so you have to manually enable and disable it on the board itself, and you can do this by pressing function plus left shift. Now while you can't enable this setting on the software, in the advanced tab you can configure the quick tap settings and profiles. The customization here is a little simple admittedly compared to other boards, but it does the trick. There is also a macro tab where you can record and assign macros to the board, and lastly we have the settings tab where you can change the software's language, find support information, update the board locally, and most importantly set the polling rates for the board. By default the board is set to 8000 Hz, but you can adjust this to 2000, 4000, or 1000 if needed. One thing I wanted to also mention here, when you update the board it does wipe your memory profile, so I had to reset my board from scratch. I'm not sure if this was intentional or not, but keep this in mind if you update your PCMK2HE as it might wipe your settings. But overall, the PCMK2HE software is decent. There is less performance options than I've seen in other high performance boards such as the HM80, but there's a passable amount of customization here. Hopefully we'll see the board updated with more performance features in the future. I would also love to see the board support both predefined and customizable performance profiles for the adjustable actuations and performance features, as having a predefined configuration for the actuation points on the board would make the experience much better for first time users, and it would allow users to select a specific actuation profile either locally or via the board via command shortcut, as that'd be a much smoother experience than the current manual configuration options available on the board. Alright, well in closing, overall I do think Pulsar is on the right track here with the PCMK2HE, as it's significantly better than their previous keyboards, but as I mentioned earlier, when compared to other high performance boards that are available on the market, in its stock configuration at least, the board still falls short, not only in terms of performance features but also performance. My biggest gripe with the board, aside from the lack of performance features and preset performance profiles for the adjustable actuation, is the Pulsar X Gateron magnetic switches. As I talked about earlier, over my 6 weeks of testing this board, I ran into a lot of issues with these switches' durability and consistency, and because of this I have some serious concerns about the switches' long-term durability, as I highly doubt the switches are going to last anywhere near their rated 150 million plus keystroke rating, considering I had several switches fail well below 10,000 keystrokes. In all honesty, the board's hot swap ability did save the board to a degree, as using aftermarket switches such as the Gateron Jade Pros does astronomically improve the board's feel and performance, but even with aftermarket switches, the board itself still falls short compared to other high performance boards on the market in my opinion. If Pulsar sold the PCMK2HE with Gateron Pro or TTC COM switches stock, I think the board would be a much better buy, but still it is lacking a lot of performance features again, and that is one of the other biggest downsides aside from the stock switches, and in its current configuration I cannot recommend buying this board, as you can get similar performing boards with much better stock switches and more performance features for similar or cheaper prices from other brands. Alright, well with that is going to be everything for this episode of the mel0n Review. Big thank you to Pulsar for sending over the PCMK2HE for review, I greatly appreciate it. Big thanks to our channel members Yuki89, Prince, It Was Luck, and Lunaris. Our channel members make what I do here on the channel possible with the in-depth reviews and the Teardown project, so thank you very much to all of our channel members for your continued support. If you'd like to support the channel, you can become a member here on YouTube. That is one of the best ways to directly support the channel, or you can use code mel0n with a 0 over at Lethal Gaming Gear, Potent Gaming Gear, Metkeys, TJ Exclusives, and a bunch of other retailers to save yourself some money and help support the channel. Thanks again for watching my review of the Pulsar PCMK2HE, and I'll catch you all in the next episode of the mel0n Review. Peace.